Hey everyone, today I'm going to talk about your first summative over magical realism. So, I know I've talked with you all before about how summatives in English too typically include papers as the main summatives. In this unit, you have taken a test over a very old man with enormous wings, and that was a summative. But your overall summative for this unit is a personal narrative in which you include magical realism. So don't freak out. This is not as bad as it may seem, and we're going to review what you're going to do. So, now that you have practiced reading and analyzing stories with magical realism, you will apply your knowledge to create a narrative with the technique of implementing elements of magical realism that are significant to the development of the narrative. So, the directions are create a 2-page personal narrative that purposefully utilizes the elements of magical realism that reveals a reflective moral, so a lesson to take away after reading the narrative. So, you all have written personal narratives almost every year since you were in the 6th grade. So, this is nothing new. What is new is that you are going to include magical realism. So, it says utilize the elements of magical realism. So, what are the elements of magical realism that we have reviewed? One, it is magical realism includes elements that are illogical or that don't make sense in a normal setting. So, because this is a personal narrative, whatever setting you include in your narrative is a normal setting because it is something that has actually happened to you. So now you have to decide what is going to be the magical element that I include. So that could be a miracle. That could be something supernatural. So a ghost, some type of uh, element that you include based upon a superstition. It could be an actual magical element, anything like that. And again, use that PowerPoint that we reviewed at the beginning of this unit, I think in week 5, if you are confused about what magical realism elements are. But again, the easiest elements that you could include are something magical, something illogical, um, something superstitious, or something supernatural. And think about what we've read. A very old man with enormous wings, the old man with the enormous wings, an angel, that was the magical realism element. A woman who was a spider, that was the magical realism element. In And of Clay Are We Created, the people trying to pull out Azucena down into the mud, the brothers and sisters that she had lost, that was the magical realism, and that was the only magical realism element in that entire short story. So there are different ways you can go about this. Think about The Wizard of Oz. Dorothy was in a dream, and that is when she experienced everything to help her learn a lesson. So there are different ways you can go about this, and it is going to help you reflect on a lesson learned. So, your story should be no less than 5 well developed paragraphs that strategically reflect utilizing effective technique, well chosen details, and well structured sequences for an intended purpose. The narrative should be typed in MLA formatting, which includes Times New Roman 12 font with double spacing throughout the entire narrative. So, when you stop and think about this, Times New Roman size 12 font, double space, 2 pages. This is not a long assignment. This is not a long narrative. 2 pages, double space is probably about 500 words. So, your narrative must include you as the main character. And I am going to give you a little bit of leeway with this. I would like for you to do a personal narrative just because this is something that you have experience with. But if you would rather, you can do a narrative. So just a fictional short story that you create. But again, it needs to be 2 pages and have magical realism elements in it. So you as the main character, or if you are deciding to do a narrative, you can create a main character. You have to have a moral of the story, so a lesson that the audience can learn. And remember, in magical realism, the subject matter is a serious scenario to bring light to a lesson that needs to be learned. So, not to be greedy, treat others as you want to be treated. Humans fear what they do not know. To show love and compassion during devastating moments like in And of Clay Are We Created. So, think about something serious that you can write about that a lesson can be learned from. You have to include elements of magical realism. This could be something extremely magical. It could be a ghost. You could use a miracle. And you only have to change one thing in your story to include the magic or the illogical scenario. You are not changing the personal narrative. You are including the magical realism through changing or adding one event. So this could be the addition of a character, the changing of yourself, or the changing of another character. Think of what you know based upon the stories we have read and movies you've seen, Wizard of Oz. You need to include dialogue. Think about elements of short story. In elements of short story, you have sequencing, you have a setting, you have characters, and you have dialogue. All of those things together create a good narrative. And you have to have sequencing, so an exposition, so what happens at the beginning. You have the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and then the resolution. So again, these are all things that you have continuously learned about just through reading short stories and writing personal narratives in the past. There are some restrictions as to what you can write about within a personal narrative or within the narrative if you choose. You may not write about the loss of a loved one, because if you write about the loss of a loved one, then the narrative becomes about something else. What is the lesson? Maybe that you should have valued your time with them more, but really you're just writing about how sad you are. There's not necessarily a lesson learned, so we're going to steer clear of the loss of a loved one. You may not write about an accident that happened to someone else. You're not going to include a very large moral of the story or something that's very impactful if you talk about something that happened to somebody else, especially an accident or an illness. And you may not write a personal narrative that is about someone else. I want to know something about you. Or I want to know about a lesson that a main character learned. It doesn't need to happen based upon something else that happened to somebody else. Something needs to have happened to you and for the main character to have experienced a change to learn something. So you may be freaking out and you're not sure what you can write about at this point, especially with the addition of magical realism. But you all have to remember that a lesson can be learned from any kind of story. So if I were going to create one right now and include magical realism, I would think about my first day at college. So I'm going to write about my first day of college. The emotions are how nervous I am, how I'm scared I'm not going to do well in my classes, how I may not meet anybody. And so that is what's going to happen. So in my personal narrative, the exposition begins and I go to class on my first day. And I look at my schedule, glance down really quickly, and see that my first class is in 102 in Sharp Center. So I quickly head to 102 in Sharp Center, run in really late. It's about 8:45, and I think that my class starts at 9, so I just rush in and get a seat, and everybody's in there already, and the teacher's talking. So I'm really scared because I thought I'm late, but I thought I was early. Well, I sit down, and then about 5 minutes later, everyone exits the class, and I'm very confused. I look over and I gasp because there is a person sitting next to me that's transparent. I start talking to the person and find out that they're a ghost. And they start talking about, oh, yeah, you actually came in on the last part of a class. And I immediately get embarrassed because I was so stressed and so worried about getting to class on time, I didn't pay attention to the time or to the actual class. So instead of going to my correct class, I go to the last part of another class. I talked to the ghost, and it turns out that they are a ghost that have been at Union for many years just trying to help others. So this is my magical realism element. They talked to me about how this happens pretty often. Your first day is always a tough one, and nobody's going to judge you for what you do wrong. And then after I talk to the ghost, I look down at my schedule, pay attention to what's actually going on, and go to the first correct class. The moral of the story is that I shouldn't be too hard on myself. Pay attention to my surroundings and actually look at things in a clear mind instead of letting anxiety and stress take over. So what was the magical realism element? Talking to a ghost. So it's only that one element, okay? And again, this was something I just made up on the fly. This was not an excellent story, but you can create a story out of anything. So that is what you are going to do. So tell me one story, something that happened to you in which you learn a lesson. You include one piece of magical realism, and then you move on. And it's just 2 pages, MLA formatting. So let's look at the rubric. So you're going to be graded based upon your organization, your support and development, your syntax, diction and mechanics, and your format. So we're only going to look at the exemplary section. So for organization, your intro is going to grab my attention, and you're going to engage your audience by including the setting, talk about a situation or a problem. So what is the character going to face? And your paragraphs are going to be clearly organized around plot line for smooth progression. So again, when I talk about plot line and smooth progression, you are going to talk about the exposition, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and then the resolution. The events and the plot line is well structured for an intended purpose. So you are clearly talking about a problem and something that is learned through the plot diagram. You have support and development. You're going to use magical realism that's purposeful and helps add meaning to the story and help us learn a moral of the story. It's going to enhance the theme. And remember, the moral of the story is the theme. So in my short story, it was not to be too hard on yourself and not to let anxiety rule you. So that is my moral of the story. That is my theme. That was the lesson learned. You're going to use multiple effective narrative techniques. So narrative techniques are dialogue, description, and sequencing. Events build on one another. So we have the beginning, then you have the rising action that leads to the climax, and the falling action, the resolution. So everything has to build. And a conclusion that really connects the narrative's relevance to the intended purpose. So the conclusion is going to tell us again the moral of the story and emphasize it. Syntax, diction, and mechanics. Sophisticated, precise vocabulary, no spelling errors, varied sentence structure, appropriate verb tense, no run-on sentences or comma splices or sentence fragments, and you display overall accuracy. So just don't mess up with your spelling. Include periods, include commas, don't have run-on sentences. And then the format, Times New Roman, 12 font, double space. You're going to have a creative title that reflects on the theme. You have clear paragraphs, and you have the MLA heading, so the name, teacher, class, and date. So what we're going to do is today and tomorrow, you are going to plan out your narrative, and you're going to create a rough draft. Again, this is only 2 pages. So after you plan out your narrative, you basically have it written, and then you're going to put it into a rough draft form. So by Friday, you will have a rough draft of a personal narrative. Then we're going to have Thanksgiving break, and then when we come back, we're going to start editing it. We're going to make sure that we have all of those narrative techniques. Do we have dialogue? Do we have sequencing? Do we have descriptions of what's going on? And then we will turn it in. So I know we haven't reviewed narrative techniques very much, but again, this should be a review. And then we're going to write out the narrative, make sure that we have that one magical realism element in it. And then as we edit, we'll review all of these things again. So don't freak out over this. It isn't as bad as it seems. A narrative or a personal narrative, 2 pages, and including a magical realism element. So again, think about what magical realism is. You could have something magical. So like an old man with wings. Someone could have wings. You could have an angel, something supernatural. Someone may have one magical ability. Maybe they can teleport somewhere else. Maybe they can become invisible. You could have a ghost. You could hit your head, pass out in a dream, and you learn a lesson in the dream because you encounter all of these magical elements. So there are different ways to accomplish this. And if you go over 2 pages, that's okay. But I really want you to focus on using the plot diagram and including all of those sequencing elements to create a concise short story, and then include that magical realism element.